Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a little blue book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 1266, and it is titled Great Fighters for Freedom, and it was written by J.V. Nash. Let's see if it has copyright date. Copyright, yes it does. Copyright 1928. See if you can see that right up there. Probably not. Nope, doesn't look like it's going to come into focus. Alright, anyhow, our table of contents are Giordano Bruno, Desiderius Ermus, Nicholas Copernicus, and Thomas Paine. And it looks like we start out with Bruno. Bruno, the first modern scientific philosopher. The man who rationalized the universe and was burned at the stake. A visitor to Rome in 1600 AD would have found the ancient city of the Caesars decked in festive attire and crowded with pilgrims of every nationality. For this was a jubilee year in which the faithful from all parts of the Catholic world gathered to do homage to the sovereign pontiff, to visit the many shrines and to gain the attractive indulgences which would free their souls from the pains of purgatory. If our visitor happened to be abroad in the early morning hours of February 17th, he might have observed a strange procession moving from the prison of the Tower of Nona to a great open space called the Campo dei Fiorani, the Field of Flowers, and I have no Italian, so I'm butchering it. Monks of St. Dominic Jesuits and members of the religious society called by a strange irony the Company of Mercy are marching in the procession. The person of chief interest, however, is a man of slender build, with a chestnut brown beard and dark of complexion, but with his scholarly face suffered with an unnatural pallor due to many years' imprisonment. He is closely guarded by officers of the law, and as the procession moves along, the monks' voices are heard chanting the litany, while the brethren of mercy insistently exhort the prisoner to repent of his heresies. Arriving at the Field of Flowers, the prisoner is led to a stake. Piled about with faggots, there he is stripped of his prison garments and bound to the stake, the monks and brethren meanwhile renewing their chanting and exhortations. Then a torch is applied to the faggots, and the victim is hidden in the pall of smoke and flame. Probably few, however, were abroad in those early morning hours, and the incident no doubt excited little interest. If our visitor inquired the meaning of the strange scene, he would have been informed with a shrug of the shoulders that an apostate monk, condemned by the Inquisition, was being burned alive. What great crime had the victim committed that merited such fearful a punishment? Had he taken human life, robbed women of their honor, or lived as a highway robber? Not at all. His life had been one of singular purity and innocence. He had never harmed a fellow man. He was a distinguished scholar who had studied and taught half a dozen of the great universities of Europe. But he had accepted the discovery of Copernicus, that the earth is not stationary and is not the center of the universe. Moreover, he had worked out a new system of philosophy based on the revelations of science, holding that the universe is infinite in extent and governed by the same natural laws from the earth to the farthest stars. For this and other heresies incompatible with the official theory of the Church, he had been seized and thrown into a dungeon, and after many years of imprisonment, he had been condemned to death by the Inquisition and handed over to the subservient civil authorities to be burned alive as a punishment for his heresies, and as a grim warning to others who might be like-minded. His name was Giordano Bruno. That for which he, Bruno, died, says MacIntyre, was not any special cult or any special interpretation of Scripture or history, but a broad freedom of thought, with the right of free interpretation of history and of nature, which, in his own case, was founded upon a philosophy, one of the noblest that had been thought of by man. When the fires of the funeral pyre at last smoldered and died out, the ashes of the philosopher were collected and scornfully scattered to the winds. But unknown to his executioners, his spirit was destined to be carried by the same winds to all the far corners of the earth, until at last, in 1889, reverent admirers of Bruno from all the nations of the world assembled in the Campo di Fiore, despite the protests of the reigning pope, to dedicate a monument in his memory on the spot where he had suffered death nearly 300 years before. The martyrdom of Giordano Bruno is one of the outstanding milestones in the long and painful history of human progress and mental emancipation. So significant is it that many liberals have suggested the date of Bruno's execution, AD 1600, as the year 1 of a new human era. No end in history, to quote MacIntyre again, is more tragic, when looked at in all its circumstances, than that of Giordano Bruno. First, a life of endless, unresting struggle, striving through years of wandering in many lands to overcome prejudiced and outworn authority, to proclaim and urge on unwilling minds the splendid gospel which inspired to supplant the old, now admired of kings and sought after by the highest in the land, at another time a hunted peddler of literary wares. Then 8 years in darkness from the world, with shame or death to choose for release, the choice made for the nobler end. The mockeries of religion he had detested and reviled pursued him to the end, to the very end. And the funeral pyre of this martyr for liberty of thought, for the new light of science, became a spectacle for the gay and thoughtless sightseers of the Roman Jubilee year, to all of whom one sad disciple expected, it was but another damnable and obstinate heretic, who was on this earth for that brief spell, foretasting his eternal doom. As Carrier remarks, in the spirit of a man who stood firm in his opinions under such tremendous and long-continued effort to break him down, the governing motives must have been an eternal and inviolable impulse towards truth, an unbending sense of right, an irrepressible and free enthusiasm. At the time of his martyrdom, Bruno was some 32 years of age, for he was born in 1548 at the little town of Nola, in the then Spanish kingdom of Naples. His father was a military man, evidently a good family. The boy was baptized under the name of Philip, as a compliment, it is inferred, to the King of Spain. The name Giordano was adopted when Bruno became a monk. The boy grew up in a pleasant environment. His home was on the lower slopes of Mount Sicilia, and set in the midst of beautiful gardens, with the majestic cone of Vesuvius capped by wisps of smoke rising from the blue waters of the Bay of Naples into the cloudless azure sky. It was there, no doubt, that Bruno, was inspired by a love of nature, which later was a powerful influence in his discarding of hoary traditions and artificial systems of thought. Then, too, Nola had been a Greek colony, and the free Greek spirit, with its love of beauty and worship of truth, continued throughout the centuries to hover over the enchanting spot. In Roman days, Nola had been an important town. It was there that the Emperor Augustus had come to end his days. It boasted 2 large amphitheaters and many beautiful temples. During the Middle Ages, it had been the scene of much tribulation. But even in the 16th century, it was beautiful still. And during the darkest days of Bruno's checkered life, his mind turned to Nola with affectionate remembrance. The Garden of Italy, he called it. Bruno's father joined to the military profession a taste for literature, as we learn that he enjoyed the friendship of the poet Tansilo, whose verses first awoke in the young Bruno a deep devotion to the Muses. An anecdote of childhood which Bruno in after years related casts an interesting sidelight on the moral influence of religion in 16th century Italy. A certain Scipio Savellino, possibly his uncle, who led a life of riotous indulgence, had for his boon companion the parish priest of a neighboring village. Once a year, on Holy Friday, he went to the priest to confess his sins, which were many and great. After the first time, the ceremony was very easily concluded, and was repeated year after year. The penitent merely said to the priest, "Father, the sins of a year ago today, you know them." An enumeration of details was therefore unnecessary. So the priest blandly replied, "Son, thou knowest the absolution of a year ago today. Go in peace and sin no more." At the age of about 11, Bruno was sent to Naples to begin his formal education. Here he studied Aristotle and the humanities, both with private tutors and in courses of public lectures. At that time the Church offered the only opening for a studious youth who was without wealth or powerful influence to enable him to choose some other career. Thus it was that Bruno in his 15th year entered a monastery in the order of St. Dominic in Naples. It is one of the ironies of history that the greatest freethinker of modern times should have issued from a Dominican cloister. The founder of that order had earned the title of the Hammer of the Heretics, because of his zeal in destroying heresy wherever it showed its head. This order was dedicated to the work of protecting orthodox theology, and in that capacity it controlled the machinery of the Holy Inquisition. The monastery in which the youthful Bruno took up his residence occupied a commanding position overlooking Naples. Like Bruno's early home, it was set in the midst of fragrant gardens. I can't say that word. It was set in the midst of fragrant gardens. It had been, indeed, the home of St. Thomas Aquinas, the father of the scholastic philosophy which dominated the official thinking of churchmen. We do not know what were the springs that first set Bruno's thoughts running in hysterical channels. Even during his naivete, he seems to have got into trouble because of too free speaking. In 1576 he became the object of more serious suspicions and learned that a formal accusation was being drawn up against him. The main charge against him appears to have been because of an apology for Arianism, which he made in a private conversation. The Arian heresy, it will be remembered, denied the divinity of Christ. In any event, it became so warm for Bruno in Naples that he fled to Rome and took refuge in a monastery there. But his enemies pursued him with renewed accusations, for among the books which he had left behind there had been discovered some of the writings of Erasmus, Erasmus. So now, casting off his monkish robes, Bruno left Rome and began his 16 years of wandering over Europe, which were to end at last with his arrest and imprisonment by the Inquisition. We cannot follow Bruno closely during these long years of exile. He goes from town to town in Italy, teaching grammar and youthful pupils, and instructing gentlemen in astronomy and philosophy. He goes to Venice looking for work, but finds the printing offices closed because of the deadly plague, which was sweeping away thousands of lives. But he puts his leisure in Venice to good account by printing there the first of his books, entitled The Signs of the Times. This was a pot-boiler, written to keep the wolf from the door, and no copies of it have survived. Then he takes to the road again and goes on to Padua, to Brescia, and to Milan, and to Bergamo. But Italy is inhospitable to an ex-monk. He decides to seek an asylum in Geneva, so he makes the painful journey across the Alps, arriving in the city of Calvin in the spring of 1579. There was a little more tolerance in Geneva now, for the gloomy father of predestination had died some years before. However, theological controversy was still running high there. Bruno soon became involved in difficulties with the Calvinistic pundits. He was charged with holding heretical opinions and with having called the ministers of the Church of Geneva pedagogues. Though he had never joined the Calvinistic Church, he was excommunicated and soon found it prudent to leave the city. Next, Bruno made his way to Lyons, an important publishing center in those days, but as he pathetically remarked, he could not make enough money to keep him alive. The following 2 years at Toulouse, where he taught classes in astronomy and philosophy. Here he found a good deal of intellectual freedom. Soon he was given a professorship at the university by election of the students, according to the custom prevailing at those times. Bruno's reputation was now in the ascendant. At the end of 1581, he went to Paris, where he delivered a course of 30 lectures on philosophy. He had a chance for a professorship there, but was unable to qualify owing to his Catholic excommunication. Already at Toulouse, he had published the first of a series of books on the art of memory. The volume attracted the attention of the King of France, who called him to the palace for a personal interview. While in Paris, Bruno published several other books, including a comedy called The Torchbearer, in which he satirized the vices of the age. For a time, he was permitted to hold an extraordinary readership at the university. It was now the year 1583, when the Elizabethan era in England was reaching its golden heights. At Paris, no doubt, Bruno had heard much of the love of learning and of the spirit of toleration that prevailed in England. There were many Italian refugees in London. Italians occupied important positions at court and at the universities, and a little later a certain Florero was an intimate friend of Shakespeare, Spenser, and Ben Jonson. So Bruno crossed the Channel, and in the spring of that year he was settled at Oxford. Oxford, however, was still devoted to Aristotle, and Bruno does not seem to have received a very warm reception. Still, after leaving, he spoke kindly of the ancient British University, which he declared to be the first in Europe, and consequently in all the world. Bruno now returned to London, where he plunged into literary society. There was the happiest period of his life, and the time of his greatest productivity. Through the friendship of the King of France, he was lodged at the house of the French ambassador in London, an enlightened and cultured man. Here, for the first time in his checkered career, Bruno had a home. He frequently accompanied the ambassador to court, where he met Queen Elizabeth and saw much of the great nobles of England. He seems to have served as a sort of secretary to the ambassador. His freedom of conscience was respected, for he was not required to attend religious services with the ambassador's family. Bruno speaks with great enthusiasm of Queen Elizabeth. His praises of the heretic queen, who had been excommunicated by the Pope, were later included among the charges lodged against him by the Inquisition. One of Bruno's English friendships was that with Sir Philip Sidney, of whom he had already heard much in Italy and in France. Bruno now met Sir Philip at the court of the English Queen, and seems to have been captivated by the charm of one whom he describes as most illustrious and excellent cavalier, one of the rarest and proudest spirits in the world. He dedicated to this noted Englishman 2 books on ethics. Altogether, Bruno published 7 books in England. One of the most important was La Scienza della Censieri, the Ash Wednesday Supper. This work was written in defense of the Copernican astronomy, but it far exceeded Copernicus in its conception of the infinity of the universe and its identification of the matter in the earth with the matter of the heavenly bodies, as well as in its daring suggestion of life on other planets. Another important book in this series was De la Causa, Principio, et Uno, of the cause, the principle, and the one, also published in London. Here he deals with such topics as the immanence of causation, the eternity of matter, matter as the potentiality of all life, the identity of the whole and its innumerable parts, the source of all individual forms in the one material substance, and the universe, all center and all circumstance. No, all circumference. Yeah, circumference. This book, which consists of a series of dialogues, has been described as the freshest and most brilliant of all of Bruno's philosophical writings. Carrière calls it a dialogue worthy of Plato. And I think we will end there for part 1. Yep. And we'll see you in part 2.